The December sky hung heavy over the Ardennes forest in 1944. Colonel Klaus Hartmann stood before a map table inside a commandeered Belgian farmhouse, studying intelligence reports that made no sense. The numbers couldn't be right. According to their reconnaissance, American armored divisions that had been decimated just weeks earlier were already back at full strength. Panthers destroyed on the Eastern Front took months to replace. Yet here the Americans were, seemingly conjuring Shermans from thin air. "Impossible," he muttered, tracing his finger across the marked positions. "We destroyed an entire tank regiment near Aachen. How were they already fielding 200 new vehicles?" What Colonel Hartmann didn't know, what few German officers could comprehend until they saw it with their own eyes, was that across the Atlantic Ocean, in a place called Warren, Michigan, American workers were rolling out finished Sherman tanks faster than German factories could produce the individual components for a single Panther. This wasn't merely a difference in industrial capacity. It was a chasm so vast it would ultimately render German tactical brilliance meaningless. This is the story of the moment when Germany's military leadership confronted an industrial reality that shattered every assumption they had made about their enemy. It's about the afternoon when captured German officers toured an American tank factory and realized they had been fighting a war they could never win. And it's about how propaganda, the very weapon Germany had wielded so effectively, became the blindfold that prevented them from seeing the truth until it was far too late. The photograph would haunt him for years. General Major Wilhelm Fischer sat in his prisoner of war compound in Pennsylvania, staring at a magazine that American guards had given the German officers as part of their so-called re-education program. The magazine dated from April of 1943, and it showed rows upon rows of Sherman tanks stretching toward the horizon at the Detroit Tank Arsenal. 907 tanks produced in a single month at just one factory. Fischer had spent his entire military career in armor. He had commanded panzer battalions in Poland and France. He understood tank production, understood the complexity of turning raw steel into a machine of war. And that's precisely why the photograph made his hands tremble. "Propaganda," he said to the American officers supervising the reading room. "This must be propaganda. No nation could produce at such a rate." The American, a lieutenant named Morrison, who spoke excellent German, smiled without humor. "That's what Hitler said too, General. When President Roosevelt announced in May 1940 that we'd produce 120,000 tanks, the Führer's advisors told him it was impossible. They called it American bluster." Fischer stared at the image again. Each of those tanks represented weeks of German production spread across multiple factories. The mathematics was inescapable. If this photograph was genuine, and the sick feeling in his stomach told him it was, then Germany had been fighting an unwinnable war since the moment America entered the conflict. But how had they remained so blind for so long? If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The story begins not in 1944, but 5 years earlier, when two fundamentally different philosophies about warfare were taking shape across the Atlantic Ocean. In Germany, tank production was the domain of master craftsmen. Each panzer emerged from factories where skilled workers hand-fitted components, where tolerances were measured in fractions of millimeters, where the philosophy was simple, quality over quantity. The German approach to tank manufacturing reflected centuries of guild tradition. When a Panther rolled off the production line at the MAN factory in Nuremberg, it was indeed a marvel of engineering. Its sloped armor could deflect shots that would penetrate a Sherman. Its 75mm gun could kill enemy tanks at ranges where they couldn't even fight back. Every gear was precision machined. Every weld was inspected multiple times. Every tank was, in its way, a masterpiece. Albert Speer, Hitler's Minister of Armaments and War Production, understood this culture intimately. When he took office in February 1942 after Fritz Toth's death in an air accident, he inherited a system that produced weapons like works of art. The problem was that the Wehrmacht needed instruments of war, not museum pieces. Speer set ambitious targets. By January 1943, he aimed for 600 Panthers per month from the Mayenne factory alone. It was an astounding goal by German standards, a complete revolution in their production methods. The workers labored around the clock. Management streamlined processes. Yet despite these Herculean efforts, actual production in 1943 averaged just 148 Panthers monthly. By 1944, they managed 315 per month, remarkable by German standards, but barely half of Speer's target. The reasons were manifold and systemic. Germany lacked the specialized machine tools needed for true mass production. Allied bombing disrupted supply chains constantly, forcing factories to shut down for days or weeks at a time. But more fundamentally, the German industrial culture simply couldn't abandon its craftsman's mentality. Each tank was still being built as if it were a custom product rather than a mass-produced commodity. The Tiger tank epitomized this approach. When it entered production in August 1942, it represented the pinnacle of German armored engineering. Its 88-millimeter gun could destroy any Allied tank from distances of 2 kilometers or more. Its armor was so thick that standard Allied anti-tank weapons bounced off harmlessly. It was terrifying on the battlefield and extraordinarily difficult to produce. In April 1944, at the peak of Tiger production, German factories managed to build 105 of them. This was celebrated as a tremendous achievement. The Tiger took approximately 300,000 man-hours to produce a single vehicle. Each one required components from dozens of different factories spread across Germany and occupied territories. When Allied bombers hit a ball-bearing plant in Schweinfurt, Tiger production dropped immediately because those precision bearings were irreplaceable. The German military leadership understood they faced a production problem, but they fundamentally misunderstood its scale. They believed the solution was efficiency improvements, tighter schedules, better coordination, more forced labor from concentration camps and prisoner-of-war compounds. What they couldn't grasp was that they were playing an entirely different game than their American adversaries. Because while Germany was perfecting the craft of tank building, America was revolutionizing the very concept of manufacturing itself. In May 1940, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt stood before Congress and announced production goals that would have seemed like fantasy just months earlier. The United States would produce 185,000 aircraft, 120,000 tanks, 55,000 anti-aircraft guns, and 18 million tons of merchant shipping, all within 2 years. German intelligence officers who read the translated transcripts of Roosevelt's speech laughed. Some filed reports suggesting the American president was mentally unstable. Others proposed that the figures were deliberate misinformation designed to intimidate Germany into a negotiated peace. Adolf Hitler himself, when his advisors briefed him on Roosevelt's announcement, dismissed it as preposterous American propaganda. The skepticism seemed reasonable. In 1939, annual American aircraft production for the military totaled fewer than 3,000 planes. The U.S. Army ranked 39th in the world in size and capability. American tank production was virtually non-existent. Just 15 medium tanks produced in 1939. The U.S. military operated with equipment that would have been considered obsolete in Europe. But what German intelligence failed to appreciate was that America possessed something Germany could never replicate: the world's most advanced mass production infrastructure, honed to perfection by decades of automobile manufacturing. When William Knudsen, former president of General Motors, took control of American war production coordination, he didn't see tanks as military equipment. He saw them as complex automobiles with guns. And automobiles were something American. Industry knew how to produce better than anyone in the world. The Ford Motor Company had revolutionized manufacturing in 1913 when it introduced the moving assembly line. By the 1920s, Ford's River Rouge complex was producing a complete automobile every 49 seconds. That same philosophy, break complex products into simple, repeatable tasks performed by specialized workers on moving assembly lines, would now be applied to weapons of war. But first, America needed factories. On a mild afternoon in June 1940, K.T. Keller, chief executive of Chrysler Corporation, received a telephone call that would change the course of history. William Knudsen was on the line with a straightforward question. "Can Chrysler build tanks?" Keller's response was characteristically honest. "I don't know. I've never seen one of these things." Within days, Keller and his chief engineer, Eddie Hunt, traveled to Rock Island Arsenal in Illinois. They climbed into an old M3 Lee medium tank, examined its components, studied its assembly. Keller said nothing during the inspection, his face revealing no emotion. But on the train ride back to Detroit, he turned to Hunt with a slight smile. "We can build this," he said, "and we can build it better." The contract came through on August 15, 1940, authorization to construct a $20 million tank arsenal. But Chrysler proposed something unprecedented, a factory designed specifically for mass production of tanks using automotive industry principles. The government agreed. Construction began immediately on 113 acres of farmland in Warren, Michigan, 17 miles from downtown Detroit. The building that rose from that farmland was unprecedented in scale. It stretched 5 city blocks long and 2 blocks wide. The main structure was protected by 3-foot-thick concrete walls designed to withstand potential bombing. Inside, engineers laid out assembly lines that would have looked familiar to any automobile worker, but were completely alien to traditional military production. The speed of construction was itself remarkable. Ground broke in late summer 1940. By April 24, 1941, still 7 months before Pearl Harbor, the first M3 tank rolled out of the Detroit tank arsenal. The walls of the factory weren't even complete. Workers had brought in a steam locomotive to keep the building warm during Michigan's brutal winter, assembling tanks while construction crews finished raising the factory walls around them. That first tank's debut was orchestrated as a public spectacle. Thousands gathered for the ceremony. The governor of Michigan attended. The chief of Army Ordnance was present. K.T. Keller himself rode in the tank as it emerged into the April sunshine. With cameras rolling and crowds cheering, the 30-ton behemoth fired its guns, crushed telephone poles like matchsticks, plunged through a pond without slowing, and then accelerated directly through an abandoned 2-story farmhouse, the building collapsing like cardboard around its armored hull. It was theater, certainly, but it was also a declaration. American industry had entered the war. By July 1942, the Detroit arsenal switched from M3 production to the M4 Sherman tank, destined to become the most iconic American armored vehicle of the war. The Sherman was far from perfect. Its 75-millimeter gun had lower velocity than German weapons, reducing its penetrating power. Its armor was thinner than the Panther or Tiger. It was notorious for catching fire when hit, earning the grim nickname Ronson among British crews, after a cigarette lighter with the advertising slogan, "Lights every time." But the Sherman had advantages that German engineers had never prioritized. It was reliable, easy to maintain, fast enough to maneuver tactically, and most critically, it could be produced in previously unimaginable numbers. The Detroit arsenal alone employed 5,000 workers by late 1942. They worked in 3 shifts around the clock, 7 days a week. The assembly line never stopped. Raw steel entered one end of the building, finished tanks rolled out the other end, and the pace was staggering. In December 1942, the Detroit arsenal set a production record that would stand for the remainder of the war. 907 Sherman tanks in a single month. That meant the factory was completing a tank roughly every 49 minutes around the clock. It was a pace that would have seemed impossible by German standards, yet by American automotive industry standards, it was merely impressive rather than miraculous. And Detroit Arsenal was just one factory among 11 plants producing Shermans. The Lima Locomotive Works in Ohio had been producing steam locomotives for decades. When war came, they converted to tank production, completing their first M4A1 Sherman in February 1942. By the time production ended in September 1943, Lima had produced 1,655 tanks. American Locomotive Company, known as ALCO, operated facilities in Schenectady, New York. They produced 2,300 Shermans alongside their continued locomotive production. Ford Motor Company contributed from their Highland Park facility, though their greatest contribution to the war effort would be the revolutionary Willow Run bomber plant. Still, Ford managed 1,690 Shermans between June 1942 and October 1943. Baldwin Locomotive Works in Philadelphia, Federal Machine and Welder in Warren, Ohio, Pacific Car and Foundry in Renton, Washington. Factory after factory converted from peacetime production to military hardware. Each brought decades of industrial expertise to bear on the problem of mass-producing armored vehicles. But the scale of production was only half the story. The real
revolution was in how these factories operated. German tank production required skilled craftsmen who understood the entire vehicle. If a component didn't fit properly, an experienced mechanic would hand file it until it did. This took time, but it ensured quality. American production took the opposite approach. Every component was manufactured to such precise tolerances that any part from any supplier would fit any tank on any assembly line. This interchangeability was revolutionary. If a transmission from the Fisher Tank Arsenal in Michigan broke on a Sherman in France, it could be replaced with a transmission from the Pressed Steel Car Company in Pennsylvania. German tank crews in the field often had to wait weeks for specific replacement parts to arrive from the specific factory that had built their particular vehicle. American factories also embraced welding over riveting. German engineers initially believed riveted armor was stronger, but Chrysler engineers proved otherwise. Welding was not only faster and easier to automate, it was also safer. When anti-tank shells struck riveted armor, the rivets themselves became lethal projectiles inside the tank, injuring or killing crew members. Welded armor eliminated this danger. The assembly line approach meant that relatively unskilled workers could be trained quickly. In Germany, tank production required years of apprenticeship. In America, a worker with 2 weeks of training could perform their specific task on the assembly line with competence. This was crucial as millions of men left for military service and factories desperately needed replacement workers. Women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers. By 1943, 8 million women were working in American defense industries. African Americans and Latino workers found opportunities in war production that had been previously closed to them. The arsenal of democracy drew workers from across the nation.
Over 350,000 people relocated to Detroit alone by the summer of 1943, all seeking employment in the booming war industries. The sheer volume of American production became almost incomprehensible. By the end of 1942, American factories had produced 27,784 armored fighting vehicles. In 1943, they produced another 29,497. In 1944, American production deliberately slowed, not because factories couldn't maintain the pace, but because the military had accumulated enough vehicles to supply both American forces and substantial Lend-Lease shipments to Britain and the Soviet Union. Over the course of the war, America produced approximately 89,568 tanks. The Detroit arsenal alone accounted for 22,234 of them, roughly a quarter of all American tank production from a single facility. For context, Germany produced approximately 25,000 tanks total during the entire war. The Detroit arsenal alone nearly matched German national production. But numbers on paper meant nothing if German commanders couldn't see them, and for years they couldn't. Or more accurately, they wouldn't believe what their intelligence officers told them. German intelligence officers weren't incompetent. They gathered reports. They analyzed captured equipment. They interrogated American prisoners. But what they collected didn't align with their understanding of industrial reality, so they discarded it as exaggeration or misinformation. When reconnaissance aircraft photographed American tank parks in England before D-Day, the images showed hundreds of Shermans assembled for the invasion. German analysts assumed these represented the accumulated production of months, perhaps years. They calculated that such losses would take the Americans half a year to replace. This assumption informed tactical decisions, strategic planning, and Hitler's own belief that Germany could still win through superior battlefield performance. They were catastrophically wrong. Oberst Friedrich Müller commanded a panzer regiment in Normandy during the summer of 1944. His unit fought brilliantly, destroying American armored formations with precision and tactical superiority. In one engagement near Caen, his Tigers knocked out 23 Shermans while losing only 2 of their own tanks. It was the kind of kill ratio that should have meant something. It should have mattered. We celebrated that night. Müller would later recall from his POW camp in Texas. We thought we were winning. We had destroyed an entire American armored battalion. Then 3 days later, they came back with fresh tanks, fresh crews, as if nothing had happened. We destroyed those too, and they came back again and again. The mathematics became inescapable on the battlefield before they became clear in the minds of German commanders. A Panther might kill 5 Shermans before being destroyed, but 6 Shermans would arrive to replace those 5. A Tiger might dominate a section of front for days, until a dozen Shermans simply went around it, because there were always more Shermans. Miller's regiment started the Normandy campaign with 48 tanks. By August, through a combination of combat losses and mechanical breakdowns, he commanded 17 operational vehicles. Replacement tanks arrived sporadically, 3 Panthers one week, 5 the next. Meanwhile, the American units they faced seemed to regenerate like a hydra, cut off one head and 2 more grew in its place. I began to understand we were not fighting an army, Müller said. We were fighting a factory, and no matter how many times we won the tactical battle, we were losing the industrial war. But understanding and acceptance were different things. Many German officers clung to the belief that their superior equipment and training would ultimately prevail. They had to believe this, because the alternative was too devastating to contemplate. That the war had been decided not on battlefields, but in the factories of Detroit, Pittsburgh, and Gary, Indiana, long before the first shots of the Normandy invasion were ever fired. The full weight of this realization would not come on the battlefield. It would come later, behind barbed wire, when German officers were taken on a journey they would never forget. By 1943, the United States was receiving hundreds of German prisoners of war every month. After the surrender of the Afrika Korps in Tunisia in May 1943, the flood became a deluge. These weren't defeated conscripts who had lost the will to fight. Many were elite soldiers, Rommel's Desert Fox veterans, who still believed in German victory and Hitler's leadership. The challenge facing American military authorities was twofold. First, how to manage hundreds of thousands of prisoners scattered across camps from Arizona to Pennsylvania. Second, how to begin the process of denazification, helping these men understand the truth about the regime they had served. The solution, implemented beginning in fall 1943, was a carefully orchestrated program that would later be called intellectual reconditioning. German prisoners would be shown the reality of American industrial capacity. They would tour factories. They would see newspapers and magazines that had been banned in Nazi Germany. They would encounter a level of material abundance that contradicted everything their propaganda had told them about a weak, decadent America. The program was controversial. Some argued it violated the Geneva Convention's prohibition on exposing prisoners to propaganda. Others worried that showing prisoners American industrial facilities might constitute a security risk. But the potential benefits outweighed the concerns. If German POWs could be convinced of certain fundamental truths, particularly about American industrial might, they might return to Germany after the war as advocates for democracy rather than as seeds of future conflict. The factory tours began in early 1944. General Major Wilhelm Fischer had spent 18 months in the POW compound at Camp Concordia in Kansas before receiving the notification. A dozen German officers of field grade or higher would be transported under guard to tour an American manufacturing facility. No details were provided about the location or purpose. Fischer assumed it was part of the ongoing re-education efforts that most German officers regarded with contempt. The journey took 2 days by train. The German officers sat in a converted passenger car, supervised by American guards who treated them with professional courtesy. They passed through countryside that looked impossibly prosperous, farms with new equipment, towns with paved streets and electric lights, none of the devastation of war that had consumed Europe. When they arrived at their destination, Fischer felt his first tremor of unease. The building before them was almost incomprehensibly vast. It stretched farther than he could see in either direction. The sign read Chrysler Detroit Tank Arsenal. They were led inside by an American Army colonel named Morrison, the same officer who had given Fischer the magazine months earlier. Morrison spoke fluent German and had clearly been selected specifically for this duty. "Gentlemen," Morrison said as they stood at the entrance of the main assembly hall, "what you are about to see is classified as confidential. However, given that the war in Europe is clearly entering its final phase, the War Department has decided that you should understand exactly what you've been fighting against." The doors opened onto a scene that Fischer would later describe as stepping into the future. The assembly hall stretched before them like a cathedral of industry. But unlike the factories Fischer had visited in Germany, places where skilled workers moved between stations, where tanks were assembled almost lovingly by craftsmen, this was something entirely different. This was a machine that happened to employ humans. The assembly line moved with inexorable steadiness. At the far end, massive overhead cranes lifted raw steel plates. Further down, workers welded whole sections with movements so practiced they seemed choreographed. Station by station, piece by piece, the skeleton of a tank took shape. "Each worker has one task," Morrison explained as they walked along an elevated platform overlooking the operation. "That man installs track pins. The next welds turret ring supports. The next mounts the transmission. None of them could build an entire tank alone, but together, this line produces one completed Sherman tank every 49 minutes. The number hung in the air like an accusation. "That's impossible," said Oberst-Richter, who had commanded a panzer division in Russia. "We've captured Shermans. I know their complexity. The transmission alone takes 147 separate components," Morrison interrupted, "all manufactured to tolerances of 1,000th of an inch. That transmission you see being installed right now is interchangeable with any transmission on any Sherman anywhere in the world. If it breaks in combat, your crew can replace it with a unit from any supply depot in under 2 hours." They watched in silence as the assembly line continued its relentless progress. A hull section moved past every few minutes. Sparks from welding torches created constellations of light. The sound was overwhelming. Hammers, rivets, the grinding of metal on metal, the hiss of hydraulics. It was not the careful precision of German manufacturing. It was something more primal, industry as force of nature. Fischer found himself calculating despite his resistance. 49 minutes per tank. That meant roughly 30 tanks per day from this facility alone. Over 900 tanks per month. One factory producing more tanks monthly than some German factories produced in a year. "This is just one of 11 factories producing Shermans," Morrison said, as if reading his thoughts. "We also have facilities producing tank destroyers, light tanks, and heavy tanks. In December 1942, this factory alone produced 907 tanks." "You're lying," Richter said flatly. "This is propaganda. These are mock-ups or—" Morrison gestured to a foreman below. The man nodded and spoke briefly to his crew. One of the partially assembled tanks on the line was marked with chalk. Morrison checked his watch. "That vehicle just entered final assembly. Let's follow it and see what happens." For the next 47 minutes, the German officers walked along the platform, following the marked tank through the final stages of production. They watched as the turret was lowered into place by overhead crane. They saw the 75mm gun installed, the radio equipment mounted, the ammunition racks fitted. They observed as workers, many of them women, Fischer noted with shock, performed their tasks with mechanical efficiency. At the end of the line, an American soldier climbed into the driver's seat. The engine coughed once, then roared to life. The tank moved under its own power off the assembly line and onto a flatbed rail car waiting outside. Morrison checked his watch again. 47 minutes. They're running ahead of schedule today. The silence among the German officers was absolute. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. They toured the facility for another 2 hours. Morrison showed them the spare parts inventory, warehouse after warehouse filled with replacement components. He took them to the quality control station where every 10th tank was subjected to rigorous testing. He even showed them the employee cafeteria, where workers ate subsidized meals that would have seemed like luxury fare in wartime Germany. But the real impact came from the numbers that Morrison presented in a conference room at the end of the tour. In 1943 alone, Morrison said, reading from an official report, the United States produced 29,497 armored fighting vehicles. That includes tanks, tank destroyers, and self-propelled guns. For comparison, Germany produced approximately 5,700 tanks during the same period. He let that ratio sink in before continuing. We also produced 300,000 aircraft, 24 million tons of merchant shipping, 41 billion rounds of ammunition, and 2,400,000 military trucks. The Ford Motor Company was producing one military vehicle every 69 seconds by 1941. 1944. American industry was manufacturing 2/3 of all Allied military equipment. Fisher felt something break inside him. It wasn't despair exactly. More like the sudden clarity that comes with understanding a truth you've been avoiding. Germany hadn't lost the war through tactical failures or strategic mistakes. They had lost it before it even began, the moment they chose to fight an enemy with 10 times their industrial capacity. "But why show us this now?" Fisher asked. "The war isn't over. This is intelligence that no longer matters," Morrison finished. "Gentlemen, your intelligence officers have known these figures for over a year. They've captured enough of our equipment to analyze it. They've interrogated enough prisoners to hear the truth. But they don't believe it. Or more accurately, they can't afford to believe it, because belief would mean admitting the war is already over." He opened a folder and showed them copies of German intelligence assessments. Report after report had underestimated American production by factors of 5 or 10. Analysts had dismissed photographic evidence as fabrications. When prisoners reported seeing endless rows of tanks in America, interrogators had written it off as exaggeration. Hitler was told about President Roosevelt's production goals in May 1940, Morrison continued. His advisors assured him it was impossible, just American boasting. Even Albert Speer, your Minister of Armaments, didn't understand the scale until it was too late. Germany was trying to win a modern industrial war with 19th century production methods. Oberst Richter, who had been silent since watching the tank assembly, finally spoke. "What happens to us now?" Morrison closed the folder. "You finish the war in the camps. You're treated according to the Geneva Convention. You work, you eat better than many American citizens did during the Depression, and eventually you go home. But first, you help us understand something." He looked at each of them in turn. "Why did you keep fighting when the numbers made victory impossible?" The question hung in the air. Finally, Fisher spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "Because we believed. We believed in German superiority, in the weakness of our enemies, in the promises made to us. We believed that one German soldier was worth 5 Americans, that one Tiger could defeat 10 Shermans, that quality would triumph over quantity." He gestured toward the window where they could see the assembly building in the distance. "We believed because we had to believe. The alternative, that we were fighting a war we could never win, was unthinkable." "Until today," Morrison said quietly. "Until today," Fisher agreed. The German officers were returned to their camps. Most would spend the remainder of the war working on American farms or in factories, earning wages and witnessing firsthand the material abundance that contradicted everything their propaganda had taught them. When they returned to Germany after the war, many would become advocates for democracy and reconciliation, having seen with their own eyes the futility of militaristic ambition against industrial reality. But the impact of what they had witnessed extended far beyond individual conversions. The factory tour revealed a truth that would reshape post-war thinking about military conflict, that modern war had become as much an industrial contest as a military one, and that no amount of tactical brilliance could overcome a 10-fold disadvantage in production capacity. Albert Speer himself would later acknowledge this reality in his memoirs, written after 20 years' imprisonment at Spandau. Reflecting on his time as Minister of Armaments, he admitted that Germany's fate had been sealed by industrial mathematics. Despite his armaments miracle, tripling German tank production from 9,540 vehicles in 1941 to 17,300 in 1944. It was never enough. We were competing against factories that made automobiles before the war, Speer wrote, in Inside the Third Reich. They simply applied automobile mass production principles to military equipment. What took us weeks, they accomplished in hours. What required our skilled craftsmen, they achieved with workers who had trained for days rather than years. Speer's most revealing admission came in his assessment of the Sherman tank itself. Despite German tactical superiority, Panthers and Tigers regularly achieved kill ratios of 5-to-1 or better against Shermans. It ultimately meant nothing. The Sherman's great advantage was that it had a very powerful motor in proportion to its weight, Speer noted. Its cross-country mobility on level ground was definitely superior to that of our tanks. But more than that, it could be produced in quantities we could never match. For every Panther we built, they built 5 Shermans. For every Tiger, 10. Superior engineering became irrelevant in the face of such numbers. The irony was not lost on Speer or other German leaders after the war. Germany had invested enormous resources in developing technically superior weapons. The Tiger II with its 188-millimeter gun, the Panther with its sloped armor, even experimental designs like the Maus super-heavy tank that weighed 180 tons. Each was a marvel of engineering. Each was also extraordinarily difficult to produce, maintain, and supply in the field. Meanwhile, the Americans had designed the Sherman for mass production and maintenance. It used a gasoline engine adapted from aircraft, not as fuel efficient as diesel, but available in massive quantities. It used a cast turret that could be manufactured more quickly than welded designs. It was wide enough to accommodate future upgrades. It was simple enough that a crew with basic training could perform field maintenance.
The Sherman wasn't the best tank of the war by technical specifications, but it was the right tank for the war America had to fight. A war of logistics, endurance, and overwhelming force. The moment of true understanding for the German military establishment came not with dramatic battlefield defeats, but with quiet calculations in prisoner-of-war camps and interrogation rooms. It came when officers like General Major Fischer ran the numbers and realized that even if every German soldier fought with superhuman courage, even if every tank commander achieved perfect kill ratios, the mathematics remained implacable. Consider the arithmetic that haunted Fischer during his captivity. At peak production in 1944, Germany produced 315 Panthers per month from all factories combined. During that same period, just the Detroit arsenal alone produced an average of 400 Shermans monthly. Add in the other 10 Sherman production facilities, plus American production of tank destroyers, light tanks, and heavy tanks, and the disparity became absurd. The United States was producing more tanks every single day than Germany produced in a week. And this was just tanks. American factories were simultaneously building bombers at a rate of 1 per hour at the Willow Run plant, constructing Liberty ships faster than U-boats could sink them, and manufacturing ammunition in quantities that German logistics officers considered physically impossible. The psychological impact on German prisoners who understood these figures was profound. Many had been captured while still believing in German victory, convinced that superior technology and fighting spirit would ultimately prevail. The confrontation with American industrial reality didn't just defeat them, it retroactively erased the meaning of their sacrifices. Oberst Müller, the panzer commander from Normandy, struggled with this cognitive dissonance during his captivity. He had destroyed 53 Allied tanks during his career, had been awarded the Knight's Cross for valor, had lost half his regiment in combat. And for what? Every tank he destroyed was replaced before his mechanics could repair his own damaged vehicles.
Every small victory was meaningless in the context of industrial war. "I thought we were fighting soldiers," he told American interrogators in late 1944. "Instead, we were fighting factories. How do you defeat a factory with a tank?" This was the central tragedy of the German war effort. Their soldiers were often more skilled, their officers more experienced, their equipment technically superior. But they were playing the wrong game entirely. Modern industrial warfare had moved beyond the battlefield. Victory was being decided in the factories of Detroit, the shipyards of California, the aircraft plants of Washington and Kansas. The German High Command's failure to grasp this reality earlier was not simply a matter of poor intelligence. It was a failure of imagination. German military culture, forged in the Prussian tradition, emphasized battlefield prowess, tactical brilliance, and the superiority of German arms. The idea that wars could be won by factory workers, many of them women and minorities, assembling tanks on production lines was antithetical to everything their tradition represented. Hitler himself never fully accepted this reality. Even in the final days of the war, he spoke of wonder weapons that would turn the tide. The Me-262 jet fighter, the V-2 rocket, experimental designs that existed only on paper. He couldn't comprehend that technical innovation without production capacity was meaningless. A weapon that was 90% better but could only be produced in 10% of the numbers was actually worse than the weapon it was meant to replace. Albert Speer tried to explain this to Hitler multiple times. In private meetings documented in Speer's post-war testimony, he showed the Führer production figures comparing German and American output. Hitler would rage, insist the numbers were fabrications, claim that German fighting spirit would overcome material disadvantage. When Speer pressed the point, Hitler would simply order him to work harder, produce more, find ways to match American production. It was impossible, and Speer knew it. Germany lacked the raw materials, the machine tools, the transportation infrastructure, and most critically, the industrial philosophy that made American production possible. You couldn't simply order German factories to produce like American ones, any more than you could order the sun to rise in the west. The aftermath of this industrial mismatch shaped the final year of the war in Europe. By late 1944, German tank formations were shadows of their former strength. Units designated as panzer divisions might field 20 or 30 tanks instead of their authorized hundreds. Replacements arrived sporadically, if at all. Meanwhile, American and British forces advanced with armored formations that seemed inexhaustible. The Battle of the Bulge in December 1944 represented Germany's last major offensive in the West. Hitler had hoarded resources for months to assemble the force. 28 divisions, 200,000 men, and nearly 600 tanks. For a brief moment, it seemed the old German military brilliance might triumph again. American units were pushed back. Confusion reigned. The front line bulged dangerously. Then American industry demonstrated its true power. Within days, entire new tank battalions arrived as reinforcements. Lost vehicles were replaced seemingly overnight. Supply lines that should have taken weeks to establish materialized in days. The German offensive, which had been premised on capturing American fuel depots because Germany couldn't supply its own forces, ground to a halt not through battlefield defeat, but through simple exhaustion against an enemy that couldn't be exhausted. American losses in the Bulge were significant. Nearly 90,000 casualties, hundreds of tanks destroyed. But within a month, American forces had completely reconstituted. The German formations that had attacked never recovered. The panzers destroyed in the Ardennes forest were irreplaceable. The men killed or captured represented the last reserves of German military strength. The war in Europe ended 5 months later. When German forces finally surrendered in May 1945, fewer than 1,000 operational German tanks remained on all fronts combined. American forces in Europe alone fielded over 5,000 tanks, with thousands more in reserve and hundreds more arriving weekly from factories that had never stopped producing. The prisoners of war returned to Germany beginning in 1946, after spending months or years witnessing American abundance firsthand. They brought back stories that seemed like fantasy to Germans who had endured years of rationing and deprivation. They spoke of POW camps where prisoners ate meat regularly, where canteens sold candy and cigarettes, where educational programs taught them skills for peacetime careers. Many of these former prisoners became leaders in rebuilding Germany. They had seen democracy function. They had witnessed industrial capitalism produce prosperity, rather than the poverty and chaos that Nazi propaganda had predicted. They understood that Germany's future lay not in military revanchism, but in peaceful economic competition. General Major Fischer returned to what remained of his hometown in 1947. He spent the next 30 years as an educator, teaching industrial management at a technical university. In lectures, he would sometimes describe his visit to the Detroit arsenal, the moment when he understood that the war had been lost before it began. "We thought we were fighting a war," he would tell his students. "We were actually taking an examination in industrial capacity, and we failed before answering the first question. The lesson isn't that we should build more tanks next time. The lesson is that industrial wars cannot be won through military means alone. They require economic foundations that take generations to build." This lesson extended far beyond Germany. The Cold War that followed World War II was, in many ways, a continuation of this industrial contest. The Soviet Union and United States competed to demonstrate superior production capacity, building more missiles, more aircraft, more of everything. The ultimate Soviet collapse came not from military defeat, but from the exhaustion of trying to match American industrial output while maintaining a fundamentally less efficient economic system. The factory tour that changed Fischer's understanding of the war became part of a broader American program. By the end of 1945, thousands of German prisoners had visited American industrial facilities. The program was controversial. Some Germans claimed it was propaganda. Some Americans worried it revealed too much. But the impact was undeniable. Post-war surveys of returned prisoners showed that 74% left America with positive views of American society, and 85% expressed belief in democratic governance. These were men who had entered captivity as convinced Nazis, who had fought for Hitler's vision of German supremacy. What changed their minds wasn't speeches or pamphlets. It was the simple evidence of walking through factories, seeing the abundance of American stores, witnessing the material reality that contradicted everything they had been taught. The story of German officers discovering American tank production capacity is ultimately a story about the power of truth to overcome propaganda. For years, Nazi propaganda had told Germans that they were superior to their enemies, that American society was weak and decadent, that German military prowess would triumph over any material disadvantage. The propaganda was effective because it told Germans what they wanted to believe. But propaganda cannot survive contact with overwhelming contrary evidence. A man can be told that a factory is impossible until he stands inside that factory and watches it operate. He can be assured that production numbers are exaggerated until he sees 900 tanks roll off an assembly line in a single month. The tank assembly line at Detroit became a metaphor for American power in the 20th century. It represented a new kind of strength, one based not on warrior culture or martial tradition, but on industrial organization, mass production, and systematic efficiency. German officers who had studied Clausewitz and Moltke found themselves confronted with Henry Ford's assembly line philosophy, and the assembly line won. Colonel Hartmann, the officer from our opening who couldn't understand how American tank formations regenerated so quickly, survived the war and eventually read Speer's memoirs in the 1970s. In a letter to a historian researching German POW experiences, Hartmann wrote, "When I stood in those Belgian woods in December 1944, staring at intelligence reports that made no sense, I thought our analysts were incompetent. I thought American resilience was luck or deception. I never imagined that across the ocean factories were operating 24 hours a day, producing tanks faster than we could destroy them. If I had known then what I know now, if any of us had known, we would have understood that we were not fighting a war. We were fighting mathematics, and mathematics always wins." The Detroit arsenal continued operating after the war, producing tanks for Korea, Vietnam, and subsequent conflicts. The building that had produced 22,234 tanks during World War II became the home of U.S. Army Tank Automotive Command, managing American armored vehicle development for decades. The show was...
Facility closed for tank production in 1996, its mission complete. But the land remains an active Army installation managing vehicle systems and research. Today, if you drive through Warren, Michigan, you can see the massive structure that once housed the assembly lines. It's been parceled and repurposed for civilian use, but the scale remains imposing. 5 city blocks long, 2 blocks wide, 3-foot-thick concrete walls. It stands as a monument to American industrial power at its peak, when factories determined the fate of nations and assembly lines, decided the outcomes of world wars. The Sherman tanks that rolled off those assembly lines are now museum pieces. Visitors can see them at the National World War II Museum in New Orleans, at the Bovington Tank Museum in England, at dozens of memorials and historical sites around the world. They're outdated now, obsolete by modern standards, curiosities from a different era of warfare. But they served their purpose. They were never meant to be the best tanks ever built. They were meant to be good enough and numerous enough to win an industrial war. And in that task, they succeeded completely. The German officers who toured American factories carried that knowledge back to a destroyed Germany. They had seen the future of warfare, and it was a production line. They had witnessed the power of industrial democracy to outproduce military autocracy. They had learned, too late to change the outcome, that modern wars are won in factories long before soldiers ever take the field. In the end, the story of Germany discovering American tank production is not really about tanks at all. It's about the moment when one worldview, based on martial prowess, technical superiority, and warrior culture, crashed against another worldview based on mass production, industrial efficiency, and democratic capitalism. It's about the instant when German officers realized they had been fighting the wrong war, using the wrong methods, against an enemy they had never truly understood. It's about the recognition, stunning in its clarity and devastating in its implications, that quality multiplied by insufficient quantity will always lose to adequate quality multiplied by overwhelming quantity. It's about the arithmetic of modern war, where one tank every 49 minutes beats one technically superior tank every week. And it's about the photographs that haunted General Major Fisher for the rest of his life. Images of assembly lines stretching toward the horizon, of tanks arrayed in rows that seemed endless, of an industrial capacity so vast that it rendered individual courage, tactical brilliance, and technical superiority ultimately meaningless. The war was over the moment Germany attacked a nation with 10 times its industrial capacity. Everything that followed, the battles, the casualties, the tactical victories and strategic defeats, was simply the slow,
bloody process of mathematics asserting itself. Against ideology, the German soldiers fought bravely, their officers planned brilliantly, their engineers designed magnificently, and they lost completely, inevitably, because they never understood that modern war had become an industrial contest, and they had challenged the world's greatest industrial power to a competition they could never win. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.